They told me right there in front of everyone, "Sit down and keep quiet. You'll only embarrass us." The words were not whispered. They were not softened. They were spoken clearly enough that others nearby could hear, and heads turned, curious and uneasy. My son's voice was the one that carried them, but I could feel her, the daughter-in-law's, hand pressing the weight into his back, pushing him to say it. The air around me tightened, like walls closing in, and in a moment that should have belonged to pride and gathering, I was cut down to nothing. It was before the event began. People were still finding their seats, adjusting ties, smoothing dresses. The hall glowed with anticipation, conversations buzzing like restless bees. For most, it was a night of recognition, a night of speeches, a night when history and honor would be spoken aloud. But for me, it became something else. A night where my place, already fragile, was broken by a command spoken without shame. I stood there with my coat still on, an old habit of keeping it close when I never quite felt welcome. I had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that tonight might be different, that maybe someone would remember, that maybe my years of work, of sacrifice, of shaping what had brought us all together, might warrant a seat closer to the front. But the truth came quickly and without mercy. "Sit down. Be quiet. Don't shame us with your presence." I looked at my son. For a moment I searched his eyes for a flicker of regret, for some hesitation that would soften the blow. But his gaze darted away, avoiding mine, as though I were a stain he could not scrub out in time. Others around us shuffled uncomfortably, pretending not to have heard, but the silence of their eyes was as sharp as the words themselves. Betrayal rarely comes in the roar of enemies. It comes in the quiet agreement of those who should stand beside you. So I obeyed. I moved toward the side, each step feeling heavier than the last. I chose a chair against the wall, far from the center, far from the stage. It was not assigned to me. I was placed there by their will, by their fear of what I represented. And as I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, I felt the sting of being erased in plain sight. The conversation swelled back to life around me, laughter returning, voices rising, as if my humiliation had been a necessary interruption quickly forgotten. But I did not forget. I could not. The moment carved itself deep into me, sharper than years of silence, sharper than all the dismissals before, because tonight was supposed to be a night of acknowledgement. Tonight, history itself would be spoken aloud. And yet, before a single word had been said on stage, my own blood had silenced me, pushed me into the shadows as though my voice, my story, my very presence was an offense. I sat with my back straight, though every part of me wanted to fold. I listened to the shuffle of feet, the hum of voices, the anticipation building in the crowd. And beneath it all, I carried the weight of a truth they could not see, that I was not a man to be hidden, not a ghost in the margins. I had once been the reason nights like this could even exist. But for now I remained in the corner, a shadow they had forced into silence. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that the night had not yet spoken its last word. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever lived through something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It's a small action, but it truly helps us grow this channel. And now we continue. They placed me near the wall, as far from the stage as one could be without stepping outside the hall entirely. The chair was stiff, narrow, set slightly apart from the neat rows where everyone else sat shoulder to shoulder. I lowered myself into it slowly, feeling the distance settle like a weight on my chest. It was not an accident. No, this was deliberate. A seat chosen not for my comfort, but for my removal. A place where I could be seen only as a reminder, not as a presence. From where I sat, the room unfolded like a world I no longer belonged to. The stage, glowing in soft light, drew everyone's attention forward. The crowd filled the center, laughter bubbling, whispers rushing like wind through tall grass, faces turned toward one another, animated and alive. And then there was me, pressed to the margins, my shadow stretching long across the wall as if to emphasize the truth. I was not part of this gathering. I was something extra, something set aside. I watched the backs of heads in front of me, row upon row, all pointed toward the stage. None of them turned. None of them wondered why I had been pushed to the edge. And even if they did, they would not ask, because silence is easier, because pretending not to see is safer than admitting what has been done. Betrayal is rarely loud. Most often it hides in plain sight, woven into the stillness of those who look away. The wall behind me was cold. I could feel it pressing against my shoulders, reminding me that I had been aligned with stone and plaster rather than people. My chair scraped against the edge of the carpet, half on it, half off, as though even the fabric of the room refused to grant me full place. I folded my hands, resting them on my lap, and stared forward, unwilling to bow my head, but unable to escape the heaviness that filled me. I thought of how many times I had stood in front of crowds before, back when my name still carried weight, when people still turned to me for guidance, when I was not just a man growing old in the corner. I remembered the strength of those days, the sweat and the struggle that built the very foundation on which this event was now taking place. And yet, here I was, exiled to a wall, erased by the very ones who had benefited most from my labor. The sound of chairs shifting closer together echoed through the hall. Families and colleagues leaned toward each other, sharing stories, whispering about the guest who was about to speak. I had no one beside me. The seat next to mine remained empty, as if even space itself had decided I should sit alone. That emptiness was louder than any insult. It was a mark of separation, a sign drawn in the simplest form: he does not belong among us. But I did not move. I sat tall, though inside my chest the ache spread like fire. Every detail of the room seemed sharpened by my isolation: the shine of the polished floor, the gleam of the microphones waiting at the podium, the banners on the walls announcing celebration, legacy, honor. Words that once would have been tied to me, now stripped away, leaving me with only the echo of what I had given. I realized then that humiliation doesn't always arrive in the form of ridicule. Sometimes it comes in the placement of a chair. Sometimes it is the way a man is quietly pushed to the edge, while the rest of the world continues as though he was never meant to sit in the center at all. And yet, even as the pain burned, there was a steadiness beneath it. They could push me to the wall. They could place me in the shadows. They could bury me in silence. But they could not change the truth of who I was and what I had done. The stage awaited the guest. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation, and I sat alone at the edge of it all, holding on to the one thing they could not take: the knowledge that history has a way of speaking, even when people try to silence it. The silence around me was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of erasure. Every breath I drew seemed too loud, too noticeable, as if even the act of existing in that room was an intrusion. I could hear the rise and fall of voices all around, bursts of laughter, hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of programs being folded and unfolded in nervous hands. The hall was alive, buzzing with anticipation, but that life did not reach me. It curved around me like water around a stone, leaving me untouched, unacknowledged. I sat still, listening to words that were not meant for me. Names floated through the air, exchanged with admiration, with pride, but mine was absent. When people glanced in my direction, their eyes slid past quickly, as though lingering too long might remind them of something inconvenient. No one leaned close to speak to me. No one asked for my thoughts. No one even asked if I was comfortable in the cold shadow of the wall. Their silence became my prison, each unspoken word a brick stacked higher between me and the rest of them. The cruelty of silence is that it leaves you nowhere to go. Insults can be fought. Accusations can be defended. But silence offers no opening. It simply swallows. I looked at the floor, polished to a sheen that reflected the lights above, and saw the outline of my own shoes staring back at me. It was as though the room itself was saying, "You are here, but you do not matter." I tried to focus on the stage, on the banners that spoke of honor and legacy, on the podium where soon the guest speaker would stand. But each time I looked, I felt the sting of irony. Those words, honor, legacy, were mine once. I had given my life to build them. And yet, here I was, sitting in silence, watching others wear them like borrowed clothes, while I sat in the corner like a shadow of the man I had been. The conversations around me grew louder. They were filled with stories, memories, laughter that pulled the crowd together, in a bond of belonging, but I was not woven into that bond. I was the loose thread they had cut away, left hanging at the edge. I opened my mouth once, almost to speak, almost to offer a word into the circle of voices, but before the sound left my lips, I stopped. I knew what would happen. My voice would fall flat, land heavy, be met with polite nods or worse, indifference. Nothing silences a man faster than knowing his words will carry no weight. So I swallowed my voice, as I had swallowed it so many times before. And in that swallowing, I felt myself fading from the room. Every laugh reminded me of my absence. Every whisper reminded me that I was not included. My very breathing felt like an intrusion, and I found myself holding it back, as if by becoming smaller, quieter, I might disturb them less. But dignity should never have to hide inside silence, and yet that was where I was forced to live. Humiliation does not always come in shouting. Sometimes it comes in the way no one speaks to you. Sometimes it comes in the way the air grows heavier when you enter the room, in the way eyes look past you as though you are already gone. I sat there, the wall pressing cold against my back, and felt silence press its mark deeper into me. Not just silence, but silence that branded me, unnecessary, forgotten, erased. And yet, even as the ache grew heavier, a spark inside refused to go out. They could silence me. They could cast me into the shadows. They could strip me of place and voice. But the truth I carried, the life I had lived, the work I had done, none of it could be erased by their silence. I was still here, breathing, enduring, waiting, and though every breath reminded me of my exile, each breath also whispered a quiet defiance. I remain. The silence pressed harder, and in that corner seat I could no longer separate the present from the past. The banners on the wall, the stage glowing with anticipation, the air thick with pride. It all pulled me backward into the years when none of this existed, when everything people celebrated tonight was only an idea carried in my hands alone. I remembered the long nights when sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, the mornings when I rose before dawn to meet deadlines no one else believed possible. While others lived in comfort, I worked in shadows, shaping plans, raising walls, planting seeds that would one day grow into this very gathering. I saw myself hunched over a desk with ink-stained fingers, drawing maps of possibility on scraps of paper. I saw the sweat running down my face in the heat of summer as I lifted beams and carried bricks, every motion a promise to a future that had not yet arrived. I remembered the sacrifices that no one else had witnessed, the celebrations missed, the comforts abandoned, the aches in my body ignored because there was work to be done. And I remembered why I had done it, so that one day my family, my colleagues, my community could stand proud in a hall like this, surrounded by success, by honor, by recognition. But in this present moment, none of that was spoken. None of it was even hinted at. My name had been carefully excised from the story, as if it were an ink blot smudging a polished page. They spoke of progress, of triumphs, of legacies, but not mine. The words belonged to others now, men and women who had arrived when the hardest battles were already fought. They wore the rewards of my labor as if they had earned them with their own hands, while I sat in the shadows, invisible in the very place built from my sacrifices. It struck me then how fragile memory is, not memory itself, but the way others hold it. If you are not careful, if you are not loud, if you do not demand your place in the story, others will write you out of it. They will stand on the ground you built and tell themselves they have always been there. They will forget the cracked hands, the weary nights, the hunger, the loneliness. They will forget you. And sitting in that hall, pressed against the wall, I felt the sting of being forgotten, not by strangers, but by those whose very lives had been lifted by mine. The conversations around me rose higher, laughter spreading like wildfire. I closed my eyes, and for a moment the sound carried me back to the earliest days, when laughter was rare, when the only sound in the room was the scratch of my pen or the hammer against wood. I had not built this life for applause, but to know that those after me could live with less fear. And yet, even if my motives had been pure, even if my sacrifices had been silent, it cut deeper than any wound to see them erase me so completely. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They no longer carried the strength they once had. no longer bore the rawness of endless work. But the scars remained. Faint lines, stiff joints, the permanent memory etched into flesh. These hands had carried more than weight. They had carried futures. And though no one else in the hall cared to remember, I knew the truth that pulsed beneath my skin. Every brick, every dollar, every contract, every step forward had been born in the labor of these hands. The heaviness of that realization pressed deeper into me, heavier than the wall against my back. My life's work stood all around me, celebrated, praised, but detached from the man who had bled to make it real. And I realized that night that to be forgotten is a harsher death than the grave itself, because the body can rest in peace when it is gone, but to be erased while still breathing, to see your name stripped from the story you wrote, that is a torment only the living can know. Still, I did not move. I sat in silence, carrying the weight of remembrance alone. Let them cheer. Let them pretend. The truth remained inside me, heavy as stone. And one day, whether they willed it or not, it would rise. Behind me, the voices were not careful. They did not lower themselves to whispers. They spoke with the kind of half-muffled boldness that assumes the man in question is too broken, too small to matter anymore. I heard it as clearly as if they had bent down and said it into my ear. He isn't important anymore. Just let him sit. At least he's quiet there. The words were simple, almost casual, but they landed harder than any shouted insult. They cut, not because of their sharpness, but because of their dismissal. A sword wounds, but contempt erases. I did not turn my head. I stayed facing the stage, my eyes fixed forward, but my body stiffened as though every muscle had absorbed the strike. I could feel my ears burning, my throat tightening, that familiar sting of humiliation crawling beneath the skin. Around me the room buzzed on, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what had been said. But I had heard, and worse, I knew others had heard too. I caught my son's reflection in the polished glass of a framed picture on the wall. He stood just within reach of those words, close enough that silence was no excuse. His eyes shifted, his jaw tensed, but he said nothing. He did not correct them. He did not speak my name in defense. He simply let the words hang in the air like a verdict, unchallenged, unopposed. And in that silence, betrayal seeped deeper into me than even the voices behind me had managed. Strangers may dismiss you, but your own blood is supposed to remember. His silence told me he had chosen comfort over truth, peace over loyalty. The voices continued, not cruel in tone, but cruel in their ease. At least he's not making a scene. Better this way. The sound of them blurred with the clinking of glasses, the rustle of programs, the low hum of laughter at another table. To everyone else, it was nothing, just another string of words drifting through a crowded hall. But to me, it was a cage being built higher, each comment another bar locking me into irrelevance. I thought back to the years when my voice had once carried weight, when a single word from me could guide decisions, when men twice my size would pause and listen. To know that my words had once built futures and now my silence was considered a blessing, it hollowed me. I felt like a ghost at my own funeral, listening to mourners not grieving, but politely shoving me aside so they could eat in peace. I tried to breathe deeply, but each breath felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself resisted filling my lungs. My mind wanted to fight, to stand, to remind them with thunder in my voice who I was, what I had built, what none of them would have if not for me. But my body sat still, anchored not by weakness but by something greater, dignity. To lash out would only confirm their belief that I was nothing but noise. So I remained silent, even as their words pressed into me like nails, one after another. I looked again toward my son, hoping for even the smallest sign of resistance on his part. A glance, a word, a simple shake of the head to tell them they were wrong. But his eyes stayed lowered, his lips pressed shut. He let them speak as if their words carried truth. And in that moment, I felt the sharpest cut of all, not from those who mocked me, but from the one who had once clung to my hand as if I were unshakable. Betrayal does not always arrive as a storm. Sometimes it is the stillness of a man who will not stand when you are falling, Sometimes it is the weight of silence where a voice should have been. And as I sat there, listening to the words behind me, I realized I was being buried in real time, not by death but by indifference. Still, deep within me, something endured. Their words could strip me of recognition, could diminish me in their eyes, could press me into corners and shadows. But the truth of who I was, of what I had given, remained. And though no one else defended me, I carried the knowledge like a hidden flame. I was not irrelevant. I was the root they stood on, even as they pretended the ground beneath them had always been steady. The sound of the voices behind me was still echoing in my chest when the room suddenly shifted. The lights dimmed slightly, the murmur of conversation lowered into a hum, and then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the guest entered. A wave of applause rose instantly, thunderous and eager, the kind of applause that lifts a man onto a pedestal before he has even spoken a word. Every face turned, every hand clapped, every voice cheered. It was as though a tide had swept across the hall, pulling everyone into its current. Everyone except me. I remained in my chair by the wall, my hands resting still in my lap. I watched him stride toward the stage, his smile practiced, his presence commanding. He was someone of renown, someone the others admired, someone they believed had appeared here tonight solely by the virtue of their efforts. They clapped until their palms reddened, desperate to be seen applauding the loudest, desperate to be close to the gravity of his fame. But as I sat there, I remembered a different time. A smaller room, years ago when he was not yet a man celebrated, but a young dreamer uncertain of his path. I remembered the nights we spoke, the encouragement I gave when he doubted himself, the introductions I arranged when no one else believed in him. I remembered taking risks for him, putting my own name on the line so that doors would open where they had been locked. I had been there when his voice was still trembling, when his ideas were fragile and easily broken. I had stood beside him, invisible then to the world, but vital in ways only he and I knew. And now he entered this hall to applause so loud it shook the walls, while I sat pressed into the shadows, erased from the story. They cheered him as if he had appeared from nowhere, as if success had simply fallen into his hands, as if no one had ever carried him when he could not carry himself. They celebrated him, and in doing so they erased me further. The irony cut deeper than anything else had that night. The man they praised was a man I had once lifted, and yet here I sat, hidden at the edge, treated as a burden rather than a foundation. I watched the faces of those clapping, my son among them, standing tall, smiling proudly, as though he too had played a role in this guest's ascent. My daughter-in-law clapped hardest of all, her eyes shining with admiration, her contempt for me replaced by adoration for a man she barely knew. Not one of them remembered, or if they did, not one cared to acknowledge that it had been my hand that had once reached into the dark and steadied this guest when no one else would. The applause went on longer than it should have, an ovation of people desperate to belong to the glow of another success. I sat still, my chest tightening with the weight of memory. The past rose up like a tide, nights of hard conversations, mornings of sacrifice, the moments when I believed in him more than I believed in myself. I had not done it for recognition. I had done it because it was right, because I knew he could be more, and yet as the ovation thundered around me, I felt the cruelty of how easily the world forgets who built the road once the traveler has reached the summit. When the applause finally quieted and the guest mounted the stage, the room leaned forward in reverence. The air was alive with expectation. All eyes were on him. No one looked to the wall, no one looked to me. In their minds, I was already gone, unnecessary, erased. But I knew something they did not. I knew the truth of his beginning. I knew that behind every celebrated man stands another, often silent, often hidden, who gave more than anyone will ever remember. And as I sat there, alone in my corner, I felt a strange calm settle inside me. They could erase me with silence. They could bury me in shadows. But truth is patient, and truth is stubborn. And truth has a way of rising when no one expects it. I sat back against the cold wall, folded my hands more firmly in my lap, and fixed my eyes on the stage. Let them clap. Let them forget. The night was not finished. And history, though quiet for now, was not done speaking. As the guests settled onto the stage and the applause faded into a respectful hush, the murmurs around me began to change shape. Pride crept into voices that had been dismissive only moments before. I listened as my own son, standing with his wife and a circle of colleagues, leaned closer to another man and said quietly, but not so quietly that I couldn't hear, how much he had been there from the start. Others nodded, eager to add their own pieces to the story. Suddenly, the guest's success became their story, their triumph, their legacy to claim. One said he had given advice in those early years. Another insisted she had offered encouragement when it mattered. My son, my own flesh and blood, smiled as if the very presence of this guest tonight was somehow his doing, as if history had unfolded on his terms. And they believed themselves. They puffed their chests with borrowed honor, speaking lines rehearsed from lies they had told themselves long enough to begin sounding like truth. I sat against the wall, still and silent, watching this play unfold. The irony pressed heavy on me. I knew each of those nights, each of those struggles, each of those uncertain days when the guest nearly faltered. I knew because I was there, not in the background, not as a spectator, but as the man who lifted him, who placed his feet back on the path, who bore the weight of his doubts when they threatened to crush him. I had been the voice when his own voice failed, the shield when doors slammed shut in his face, and now I listened as others wrapped themselves in garments stitched for my labor. It was not just arrogance. It was theft. They weren't stealing from my pride alone. They were stealing from truth itself, rewriting the foundation of another man's rise with their own names etched in where mine once stood. And the crowd, eager to believe a polished narrative, nodded along. To them, it did not matter who had truly been there. What mattered was who was loudest now, who smiled with confidence, who claimed the story with enough certainty to make it believable. I turned my eyes toward my son, searching his face for even the faintest shadow of hesitation. Did he not remember? Did he not recall the nights I returned late, weary and broken, after sitting with that young man who would become tonight's guest? Did he not see the truth in his own childhood? The times I sacrificed food from my own table to make sure the guest could pursue his vision? My son had been there, not always in the room, but close enough to know the truth. And yet, in this hall, he played along. He claimed credit. He let my name be buried further under the noise of false pride. The bitterness rose like bile in my throat, but I did not speak. I sat still, staring at the stage, while behind me and around me the voices grew louder with self-congratulation. They were intoxicated with borrowed glory. And I understood then the cruelty of history when left in the hands of the careless. It is not only forgotten, it is rewritten. Those who should have remembered me were eager to erase me, eager to replace me in the story with themselves. The guest began to speak then, his voice warm, carrying easily across the room. The crowd fell silent, eager to hear him, their stolen claims tucked away like hidden trophies. I remained in my chair by the wall, invisible to all of them, carrying the weight of memory they had abandoned. They had recast themselves as the founders of his success, as the voices who guided him, while I, the one who had truly stood at the beginning, sat exiled, watching history slip further from my grasp. But even in that moment, I knew something they did not. Stories told loudly are not always the stories that endure. Truth, even buried, has a way of breaking through. They could drape themselves in false pride tonight, but I carried something they could never touch. The memory of what really was, the unshakable knowledge of my own sacrifice. And though they thought they had written me out, the story had not yet reached its end. I sat there with my hands clenched together, fingers digging into one another as if I could hold myself intact by force alone. My nails pressed into the skin of my palms until it stung, but even that sharpness was nothing compared to the ache spreading through my chest. I kept my face still, expressionless, while inside everything twisted. I wanted no one to see how much their words had cut me, how their rewriting of the past had pierced me deeper than any blade. Pride forced me into silence, but silence was its own punishment. It gave my pain nowhere to go but inward. The hall was warm with voices, with movement, with anticipation. Yet for me it was cold, a kind of cold that seeps into the bones, that steals breath, that sits heavy on the heart until it feels as if it has turned to stone. I had endured harsh winters, sleepless nights, storms that threatened to break the roof above me. But none of those had left me as hollow as this. Because frost on the skin can be thawed, wounds on the body can heal. But the frost of humiliation does not melt easily. It settles into the marrow, leaving the spirit brittle. Every glance in my direction seemed to confirm it. Some people looked at me briefly, then quickly away, as though my very presence embarrassed them. Others did not look at all, as if by ignoring me they could erase me completely. My own son never once turned to meet my eyes. That cut deeper than the rest. His silence and avoidance felt like chains tightening around my chest. When a stranger forgets you, it hurts. When your own blood pretends not to see you, it freezes you from the inside out. I thought of the years when my voice had once carried warmth, when my family leaned into my words as if they were shelter, when I was the one people sought for strength, for guidance, for reassurance. Now those same lips that once asked for my wisdom would not even speak my name aloud. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. I felt as though I had been exiled not just from the hall, but from my own life. Everything I had been was slipping into shadow, and I was left sitting there with only the cold weight of my silence. The applause rose again, sudden and fierce, and the sound hit me like a wave. My body did not move, but inside I flinched. That roar was not for me, had never been for me, not tonight. It was for others, people who stood proudly in the light, people who had no fear of being forgotten. I sat still, my hands locked together tighter, as if bracing against the sound itself. And as it thundered in my ears, I felt smaller, quieter, as though the very air was pushing me out of existence. What is humiliation if not a steady erosion? It is not one moment but many, each comment, each silence, each glance chipping away at who you are until you wonder if you exist at all. Sitting there by the wall, I felt those chips falling from me, piece by piece. And with every fragment lost, the cold inside me deepened. It was no longer just around me, it had become part of me, as if my heart itself had been carved from ice. Yet even in that hollow cold, a faint ember smoldered. Not anger. Anger would have been easier. Not revenge. That would have given me energy I did not have. It was something smaller, quieter. Endurance. The kind of endurance that had carried me through every unseen sacrifice of my life. They could bury me under silence, under lies, under dismissal, but they could not make me vanish. I sat with my back to the wall, with my hands clenched together, and though the cold of humiliation seeped deep, I refused to collapse. I remained upright, breathing through the weight, waiting, because deep inside, colder even than the shame, there was a voice whispering that the night was not finished. The truth, like fire under ash, still waited. And no matter how frozen I felt in that moment, I knew it would one day rise to burn through the silence. The hall grew so quiet, it was as if even the walls were holding their breath. The guest walked slowly toward the microphone, his steps steady, his presence commanding without effort. Every eye followed him, every head tilted forward, every chest seemed to expand with pride at being part of this moment. I sat in the corner, hands still clenched together, watching him through a haze that felt both sharp and distant at the same time. I had heard countless men approach stages before. I had watched many voices rise and fall, but tonight the silence was different. It was the silence of expectation, of worship, of a crowd hungry to hear names they recognized and stories they had rehearsed in their minds. I braced myself. I knew what was coming, or at least I thought I did. My body tightened with the instinct of a man preparing for another blow. He would speak their names. He would thank those who had never stood beside him when it mattered. He would confirm the false history that had been whispered behind me all evening, and once again I would be erased, not with cruelty this time, but with absence. The absence of recognition, the absence of memory, the absence of truth. Sometimes that is worse than open insult. It is a quiet execution, one where the world moves on without you as though you never existed. The microphone crackled softly as he adjusted it, and even that sound seemed to echo. My heart pounded in a rhythm I could not control, each beat louder than the last. Around me, faces leaned forward, lips parted, hands ready to clap at the first mention of something familiar, at the first string of words that confirmed their own importance. I looked at my son for just a moment. His chin was raised, his chest lifted, as though the speech about to begin would be another crown set upon his head. He was waiting to be celebrated, certain of his place in the story. And me? I sat further back in the shadows than anyone else. My name was not on their lips. My story was not in their eyes. All I had were the memories of the long nights, the unseen sacrifices, the moments when this guest had almost given up, and I had steadied him with a word, a gesture, a presence. Memories that no one in this room cared to remember. That was the cruelty. Not that they hated me, but that they had simply written me out. The guest looked over the hall slowly, his gaze sweeping from side to side, not rushing, not eager to begin. And in that pause the silence deepened. I felt the air tighten around me, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. My breath caught in my chest. For a heartbeat, it was as if I no longer belonged to the moment at all. I was just a spectator waiting to be crushed by the inevitable weight of being forgotten. He cleared his throat. The crowd straightened. My fingers dug deeper into my palms, bracing for the sting. And then, as his first words filled the hall, I felt something shift. It wasn't the applause, not yet. It wasn't recognition, not yet. But there was something in the tone of his voice, a steadiness, a warmth that carried the faintest tremor of possibility. Still, my heart prepared itself for pain. I had lived too long not to expect it. I had been disappointed too many times not to brace for another cut. Tonight, I told myself, would be no different. Tonight I would remain unseen, a ghost sitting against the wall, while their names, false as they were lifted into the air and celebrated. That was the role they had chosen for me, and I had accepted it with clenched hands and silent endurance. But as the first sentence rolled from his lips, as the sound traveled through the air and settled into the silence, I realized with a sudden jolt that this was not going to be the speech they expected. Not at all. Something in the cadence, something in the weight behind each word, told me that the story about to be told did not belong to them. And for the first time that night, the ice in my chest cracked, just slightly, as I leaned forward, listening. The first words struck like a spark in the dark. The guest, standing tall behind the microphone, did not begin with the expected flattery, the rehearsed list of names polished to perfection for the sake of pride. No. His eyes scanned the room with a weight that seemed to search for something deeper, and then, clear, unshaken, and resonant, he spoke my name. It was not a careless mention, not a passing note thrown away in politeness. He paused before it, let it hang in the air, as though it carried more meaning than titles and accolades. And when he said it with warmth, with gravity, with the weight of memory. My name was not an afterthought, it was the beginning. For a heartbeat, I could not breathe. My heart seemed to stop and then pound against my ribs, as if trying to break free. I thought I had misheard, that my imagination, desperate for acknowledgement, had twisted his words. But then he went on. He spoke of years long past, of nights when his vision faltered and when the road seemed impossible. And he said, in front of everyone, that I had been the one who steadied him, that when others doubted, I had believed, that when he needed strength, I had given mine quietly without ever asking to be seen. The hall stirred, heads turned, searching. Some looked at me with sudden realization, some with disbelief, others with the discomfort of guilt. The same people who had whispered that I was irrelevant, who had pushed me to the corner and stripped me of dignity, now sat frozen as the truth unfolded, not from my lips, but from the voice they all respected, the voice they had gathered to celebrate. My son shifted in his seat. I saw his jaw tighten, his hand flex against his leg, The daughter-in-law's smile, always sharp, always rehearsed, faltered and faded. They had prepared for a night where my existence was invisible, and now the one man they sought to glorify had pulled me back into the center with a single sentence. And not just with my name, but with gratitude. A gratitude that burned away the shadows they had tried to force me into. He told the story, not of their triumphs, not of their false claims, but of that one decisive moment when the foundation had nearly collapsed. He spoke of how he was ready to walk away, ready to abandon it all, and how a single conversation, a single presence, mine, had kept him standing. His words rolled through the silence like a river breaking its banks. They were undeniable, unstoppable. I sat still, my body rigid, but inside me something began to rise. It was not pride in the shallow sense, not triumph over those who had mocked me. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the vindication of memory, the confirmation that my years, my sacrifices, my endless labor had not been illusions. They had left marks, not just in stone and documents, but in the soul of a man who now chose to honor them publicly. The applause came, hesitant at first, like a ripple breaking the surface of still water, then stronger, louder, swelling until the hall was filled with it. But it wasn't for my son, not for his wife, not for the ones who had tried to erase me. It was for the truth spoken aloud, for the history that could no longer be rewritten. I felt my eyes sting, though I refused to let the tears fall. My hands unclenched slowly, fingers trembling as they opened. I had walked into this hall as a shadow, dismissed and diminished, and now, without ever standing, without ever demanding, I had been restored to the place they had tried to deny me, not by force, not by bitterness, but by truth spoken in the voice of another. For the first time that night, I sat not as a ghost, but as a man whose presence filled the room. The moment his words settled in the air, the applause tapered into a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. It wasn't the gentle quiet of respect, it was the stunned stillness of a room realizing it had been complicit in a crime of erasure, the crime of making someone invisible. My name, spoken aloud, honored, remembered, now lingered like a mirror none of them wanted to look into. I felt the weight of their eyes, though most could not hold my gaze. The ones who had told me to sit down and keep quiet were the first to lower their heads. Their pride, once bold, now curled inward, shrinking into shadows. Their voices, which just hours ago were so eager to silence me, had disappeared. Every whisper that had cut through me, every dismissal that had tried to push me into a corner, those words lay shattered now, trampled by the truth they could not control. I saw my son's face pale as if the blood had drained out of him. He stared down at his own hands, unable to lift his eyes toward me. He knew. In the silence that followed, I didn't need an apology, didn't need him to form the words. His bowed head was confession enough. My daughter-in-law sat stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though she could will the moment away, but her silence betrayed her. She had built her confidence on the belief that I was nothing, and now that belief was breaking apart right in front of her, under the weight of another man's gratitude. Around the hall, colleagues who once looked through me as though I were furniture, now shifted uneasily in their seats. Their applause had faded, but their guilt was loud enough to make their posture falter, and their eyes dart away. It was as though the guest speaker had opened a window, and suddenly all of them were choking on the air of their own arrogance. And yet amid their shame, I did not move. I did not lean forward to claim the moment, did not rise to demand their recognition. My body stayed still, my hands resting on my knees, my face calm. Because the truth did not need me to defend it, it had already spoken louder than anything I could say. The hall felt different now. The weight of memory had shifted. For years they had carried the illusion that my time had passed, that my contributions were ashes scattered to the wind. But the silence pressing down on them now was the silence of realization. They had been wrong. And that kind of silence, one born not of choice but of truth, was more powerful than any speech. I thought of all the nights I had been pushed aside, the countless dinners where my words were dismissed, the moments where they thought they were sparing themselves embarrassment by muting me, They thought dignity could be taken away with a gesture, with a look, with a cruel word. But dignity, I realized now, was not given by others. It had been mine all along, waiting for a day when truth itself would draw it out into the open. I sat there as the hall held its breath, as the faces around me lowered, as the walls seemed to lean in to absorb the weight of justice settling into the room. They had told me to sit down and keep quiet. And now, in their silence, I was louder than I had ever been. The guest did not stop at my name. His voice carried through the hall with a clarity that cut through the stunned silence, not as a passing courtesy, but as a truth long overdue. He spoke of years past, of days when doors were locked to him and voices doubted him, and how one man, this man, he said, his hand lifting toward the corner where I sat, chose not to turn away. He spoke of introductions that had seemed insignificant then, but that became the stepping stones to his career. He spoke of nights when others laughed, but I stayed, guiding him through the doubts, reminding him that work, faith, and perseverance were heavier than mockery. And with each memory he pulled into the light, the hall seemed to change shape. The walls no longer felt like barriers pressing me down. They became witnesses. The faces, once turned away from me, were forced to turn back, forced to hear the truth spoken from a man they revered. They could not dismiss his words. He was the guest of honor, the one they had applauded with fervor, the one they had stood for when he entered. And now he used his honor to shine it back onto me, the one they had hidden in the corner like an old coat. I saw the weight of realization settle on them. My son's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he could bury himself beneath it. My daughter-in-law's hands twisted the fabric of her dress, her pride unraveling thread by thread with every sentence. Colleagues who had built reputations on false claims and convenient amnesia sat stiff, their eyes darting like trapped birds, unable to reconcile the image they had painted with the truth that was being carved into the room like an engraving in stone. The speaker's voice grew steadier, warmer, as he told them plainly. Without him, none of this would have been possible. Without his support, his belief when no one else cared to believe, this night, this gathering, would not even exist. His words struck with the kind of force no denial could withstand. I felt my chest rise slowly, not in pride, but in something quieter, deeper, vindication. I did not need applause. I did not need them to rush to me with apologies. It was enough that the truth had been spoken in a place where lies had grown too comfortably. It was enough that the foundation of their arrogance had cracked beneath the weight of remembrance. The hall was no longer filled with the rustle of papers or the hum of casual chatter. Every ear was bent toward the voice that refused to let me be erased. And in that moment, I realized the greatest justice was not revenge, not even recognition forced by confrontation. It was this, the undeniable fact that the truth has a way of rising even when buried under years of silence. I sat still, letting the words wash over me, letting their echo seep into the wood of the chairs, the fabric of the curtains, the very air of the hall. They had told me to sit down and keep quiet. But here, in front of everyone, my story was being spoken back into existence by another's voice. They wanted me to be invisible, but instead I had become the center no one could escape. And for the first time in years, I did not feel small in the corner. I felt the room itself turn, as if the very gravity of the moment had shifted toward me. I did not rise to meet the words. I did not wave my hand or clear my throat to claim the recognition suddenly offered to me. I stayed where they had placed me, at the edge of the room, a shadow against the wall. But for the first time, that corner no longer felt like exile. It felt like a throne carved out of patience, silence, and truth that refused to die. My stillness was not weakness now. It was proof. Proof that dignity does not need a stage to be seen. Proof that the loudest justice can arrive without a single word spoken by the one who has been wronged. The room had changed. Before, their silence had been a verdict against me, a cage of indifference and dismissal. But now, the silence that spread across the hall belonged to them. It pressed down on their shoulders, heavy and inescapable. Their eyes flicked toward me and then away, unable to linger, unable to deny that the man they had tried to erase was the man who still anchored their story. Every heartbeat in that hall seemed to carry the same confession. We were wrong. We forgot. We failed him. I sat with my hands folded on my lap, my face steady, my eyes fixed not on the people but on the space beyond them, as though I could see through the walls into a larger world where truth always waits. The speaker's words had already done what I never could. They had torn open the curtain of lies, revealed the scaffolding of history that bore my fingerprints, and forced everyone to see what they had been blind to. And so I let the silence grow. I let it stretch until it became unbearable, until it rang louder than applause, until it became a mirror no one could look into without flinching. My son shifted in his seat, the sound of his chair against the floor sharp in the quiet. He had no words, and that was the justice of it, because nothing he could say would erase the years of absence, of turning his face away while I shrank into the edges of his life. My daughter-in-law's breath came shallow, her pride stripped bare, her coldness undone by the simple fact that the man she had dismissed as useless had just been named as the reason she was sitting in this hall at all. And my colleagues, those who had built their reputations on the foundation of work they had never acknowledged, now faced the truth that history itself had turned against them, and that the silence between us was no longer their shield, but my vindication. I did not move, I did not speak, and yet in that moment I was the only one in the room who did not feel small. My silence was not an absence, but a presence, vast and undeniable. It filled the space, it forced its way into their hearts, and it reminded them that some truths cannot be buried. They had told me to sit down, to keep quiet, to vanish into the corner. And yet here I was, sitting still, saying nothing, and somehow louder than every voice that had once drowned me out. Justice does not always come with a gavel, nor with fire or fury. Sometimes it comes as a quiet weight that settles over a room, changing the air, forcing those who thought themselves powerful to bow to what they cannot undo. And as I sat in the silence they could not bear, I knew. This was justice. Not revenge, not triumph, but the quiet return of dignity they had tried so hard to strip away. The moment his name hung in the air, spoken with honor by the guest they all admired, something inside the room turned. It was as if the walls themselves shifted, and suddenly the light that had once ignored him now fell directly onto the man they had tried to bury in silence. For years, they had pushed him to the margins, convinced themselves he was a relic, a distraction, a burden too heavy to acknowledge. But now the balance had cracked, and it was not he who appeared small. It was them. Those who once walked with their chins high now fumbled with their hands, adjusting papers that didn't need adjusting, staring at shoes polished just that morning, pretending they hadn't heard what had been said. But their faces betrayed them. Their cheeks burned, their eyes flickered with shame, and the proud tilt of their shoulders collapsed under the weight of truth. He had not spoken a word, yet the gravity of his presence pulled the room toward him. They had reduced him to the corner. Now the corner was the center, and they were the ones dissolving into the shadows. His son, who had once averted his gaze when insults were hurled across the dinner table, now could not look away. The silence that had been his weapon, refusal to defend, refusal to stand, had become chains wrapped tight around him. Each second stretched long, each breath heavy with the knowledge that the father he had treated as disposable was the very foundation of his own standing in this world. His lips pressed together, desperate to form an apology, but no sound came. And that failure to speak was worse than all the words that had been denied before, for now he was not defending pride, but fleeing from truth. His daughter-in-law, once so sharp in her remarks, shrank against her chair as if hoping the wood would swallow her whole. She had measured him by age, by silence, by the way his hands trembled with time, but she had never measured him by history, by sacrifice, by the papers that still bore his name in ink no one could erase. Now her voice, once laced with disdain, was gone entirely. The power she thought she had held, the cruel ability to decide where he sat, when he spoke, whether he mattered, vanished like smoke in the wake of one truth revealed in public. Colleagues who had rewritten stories of success, claiming them as their own, could no longer hold their proud expressions. For too long they had built their reputations on his foundations, parading around as architects of visions they never conceived. And yet in a single speech the scaffolding they had erected crumbled. Their authority was unmasked as borrowed, their pride exposed as theft. They were no longer the centerpieces of the hall. They were shadows pressed against the edge, hiding from a light too bright for lies to withstand. And through it all, he remained still. He did not rise, did not bask in the glory that had finally returned to him. He sat in the same corner, in the same chair they had once treated as exile. And yet it was no longer exile. It was the throne of quiet endurance, a seat carved from the patience of years spent carrying the weight no one else would bear. He had been diminished, humiliated, silenced, but it was in that silence he had gathered a power stronger than their voices, the power of being undeniable. Now the roles were reversed. The man they had made invisible was the only figure the room could see. The people who had spoken so loudly, mocking him, minimizing him, now found their words turned to dust. He was not vindictive. He did not smile in triumph or savor their discomfort. He simply allowed the truth to stand taller than any of them. Because justice, real justice, does not require revenge. It only requires the light of recognition to fall where it belongs. That night, the man they once told to sit down and keep quiet became the very name that held the room together. And they, his family, his colleagues, his doubters, became exactly what they had once accused him of being: small, silent, and forgotten at the edge of history. When the evening drew to a close, the applause still echoed faintly in the walls, but none of it belonged to the people who had tried to keep him silent. It lingered like an aftertaste of truth, carrying not the names of those who postured, but his, the one they had tried to erase, the one the guest speaker had lifted into the center of the room. Slowly, without rush, he rose from his chair at the edge of the hall. No spotlight followed him, no fanfare marked his steps, yet every eye was drawn to his movement. The same man they once ordered to sit down and keep quiet now walked with the calm gravity of someone whose presence could no longer be ignored. The air was heavy, not with noise but with silence, a silence more powerful than any ovation. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet his eyes. His son's shoulders sagged with the weight of guilt. His daughter-in-law's lips trembled with words unsaid. Colleagues fumbled with papers that no longer mattered. He did not need to confront them. The truth had already done the work. What they had denied for years was now undeniable. The foundation of their pride was not theirs, it was his, and they knew it. And he walked through the hall like one walking through memory itself, each step reminding him of the sacrifices he had made, the nights without sleep, the days of labor, the moments of loneliness endured so others could stand taller. He remembered the sting of their dismissive words, the cruelty of being told to keep out of the way, the bitter taste of being treated like a burden in a story he had built with his own hands. Yet, as he moved toward the exit, none of that weighed on him anymore. It was not bitterness that filled him, but a quiet dignity that nothing could take away. Because true justice, he realized, is not about watching others fall. It is about standing without needing to prove that you belong. It is the simple, unshakable knowledge that history cannot be rewritten by envy, nor can legacy be stolen by pride. They had tried to push him into the shadows, but the truth had risen like sunlight breaking through the cracks. And once light enters, darkness has no choice but to retreat. At the door he paused, not to look back, not to gloat, but simply to breathe in the moment. For years his existence had been framed as silence, as waste, as embarrassment. Tonight, however, silence had become his greatest weapon. Waste had become the foundation of their fortune, and embarrassment had shifted to the faces of those who wronged him. He needed no apology, no declaration, no victory speech. The justice had already unfolded in front of them all. His name had been spoken, not as an afterthought, but as the cornerstone of everything they held dear. And so he left the hall, not hurriedly, not in anger, but with the calm pace of a man who knows his worth. The night air met him with a cool embrace, carrying away the last remnants of humiliation that once clung to him. Behind him, the hall buzzed faintly with whispers, but none of those voices could undo what had been done. His dignity had been restored not by confrontation, but by the simple, immovable weight of truth. From that day forward, no one could erase his name from the story. No matter how they tried to silence him, the echo of gratitude spoken by another would always remain. His legacy no longer depended on their acknowledgement. It had risen above them, etched into history by the very fact of its truth. He was no longer just a man sitting quietly in the corner. He was, and would always be, the name that could not be forgotten.